The snow outside the walls of the Kremlin in early 1942 did not just represent a seasonal change, but a fleeting moment of hope that threatened to blind the Soviet High Command. The miracle on the outskirts of Moscow had shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, pushing the German army back from the precipice of total victory. Yet, as the German retreat halted and the front lines solidified, a jagged tooth remained embedded in the landscape of the Central Front. This was the Rzhev Salient, a massive protrusion of German-held territory that pointed like a dagger directly at the heart of the Soviet capital. To Stalin, the presence of the German Ninth Army, just 150 miles from the Kremlin, was an intolerable insult and a strategic nightmare. The geography of the Rzhev Salient was a cruel joke played by nature upon those who sought to master it. It was a wilderness of dense forests, treacherous marshes, and a primitive road network that turned into a bottomless slurry of mud during the spring and autumn thaws. In the winter, the temperatures plummeted to levels that froze the oil in tank engines and the blood in the veins of wounded men. For the Soviet generals, particularly Georgi Zhukov and Ivan Konev, the salient represented an opportunity to encircle and destroy an entire German army group. For the Germans, it was a cornerstone of their entire eastern defense, a fortress that had to be held at any cost to prevent the collapse of the center. The systemic failure of the Rzhev campaigns began not with the soldiers in the trenches, but with the map makers and the grand strategists in Moscow. Stalin, emboldened by the victory at Moscow, demanded a general offensive across the entire front, spreading Soviet resources thin when they should have been concentrated. He believed the Wehrmacht was on the verge of total collapse, a miscalculation that would lead to a series of disjointed and poorly coordinated offensives throughout 1942. The Soviet command structure was characterized by a brutal impatience where tactical nuance was often sacrificed for the sake of political deadlines. This top-down pressure created a culture where commanders feared reporting failure more than they feared the loss of their men. On the opposite side of the line stood General Walter Model, a man who would earn the nickname the Lion of Defense. Model was a master of the elastic defense, a tactical doctrine that emphasized the use of fortified strongpoints and rapid counterattacks. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Model understood that in the dense woods of Rzhev, a rigid line was a brittle line. He transformed the tiny, nondescript villages of the salient into interconnected fortresses, bristling with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Every clearing was a kill zone, and every forest path was zeroed in by German artillery that had spent months pre-calculating the coordinates of every possible Soviet approach. The first major disaster unfolded in the winter and spring of 1942 during the Rzhev-Vyazma offensive. Soviet paratroopers and cavalry were dropped and funneled behind German lines in a daring attempt to sever the salient at its base. It was a plan of Napoleonic ambition, executed with medieval logistics. Thousands of Soviet troops found themselves trapped in the German rear, cut off from supplies and heavy support. Instead of a swift encirclement, the operation devolved into a desperate struggle for survival in the frozen forests. These men, intended to be the hammer, became the anvil upon which the German Ninth Army beat out a rhythm of systematic destruction. The sheer scale of the tactical failures at Rzhev is often difficult for the modern mind to grasp. Soviet infantry were frequently ordered to conduct frontal assaults across open ground, against well-entrenched German positions without adequate artillery preparation. The reasoning was often as simple as it was tragic. The ammunition had not arrived because the trucks were stuck in the mud, but the order to attack remained unchanged. Wave after wave of Red Army soldiers charged into the teeth of MG-42 machine guns, their bodies piling up in the snow until the Germans could no longer see the horizon. This was not war in the sense of maneuver and strategy. It was a meat grinder that consumed lives with industrial efficiency. By the summer of 1942, as the world's attention shifted south toward the bend in the Don River and the city of Stalingrad, the Rzhev Salient remained a festering wound. The Soviet leadership launched the first Rzhev-Sishevka offensive, a massive undertaking intended to finally bite off the salient. The fighting centered around the town of Rzhev itself, a once quiet provincial center that was reduced to a blackened skeleton of brick and timber. The city changed hands street by street, house by house. Soldiers fought with knives, shovels, and grenades in the ruins of basements, while the surrounding countryside was churned into a lunar landscape by millions of shells. It was during this period that the systemic failure of Soviet intelligence became most apparent. They consistently underestimated the German ability to shift reserves within the salient. Model utilized the internal railway lines of the Bulge to move fire brigades of tanks and motorized infantry to wherever the Soviet pressure was greatest. The Red Army would break through in one sector, only to find themselves counterattacked by fresh German units they didn't know existed. The Soviet tanks, often used in small, unsupported groups, were picked off by German pack fronts or became bogged down in the swamps that the maps had labeled as firm ground. The unsung heroes of this nightmare were the low-level commanders and the ordinary infantrymen who endured conditions that defied human endurance. There were Soviet junior officers who, seeing the futility of the orders they were given, tried to find ways to protect their men while still achieving their objectives. There were the German medics who worked in filth and darkness to save men from the ravages of frostbite and gangrene. And there were the civilians, the peasants caught in the middle, who were forced to dig trenches for one side and then the other. Their villages burned and their food confiscated as the tide of war ebbed and flowed through their backyards. As 1942 drew to a close, Zhukov prepared his most ambitious operation yet, Operation Mars. Designed to be the twin of Operation Uranus at Stalingrad, Mars was intended to be the final blow that would collapse the German center. It involved nearly 1 million men and thousands of tanks. However, while Uranus succeeded brilliantly in the south, Mars became a bloody catastrophe. The Germans had anticipated the move, and the Soviet preparations were far from secret. The offensive began in late November, in a blinding snowstorm, with Soviet divisions charging into a prepared trap of minefields and pre-sighted artillery fire. The failure of Operation Mars was a systemic collapse of coordination between infantry, armor, and air support. Soviet tanks outran their infantry and were destroyed by German tank hunters in the Luchesa Valley, which became known as the Valley of Death. Entire Soviet corps were surrounded and annihilated, while the high command in Moscow continued to demand progress. The tragedy of Mars was not just the loss of life, but the fact that it was largely erased from Soviet history for decades because it was a failure led by Zhukov, the hero of the Soviet Union. It did not fit the narrative of the Great Patriotic War. It became the forgotten meat grinder, a shadow cast by the glorious light of Stalingrad. The final conclusion of the Rzhev Salient did not come through a grand Soviet breakthrough, but through a calculated German withdrawal. In early 1943, recognizing that the salient was no longer sustainable after the disaster at Stalingrad, the Germans launched Operation Buffalo. With ruthless efficiency, they pulled back to a shorter, more defensible line, destroying everything in their wake. They left behind a scorched earth of poisoned wells, booby-trapped buildings, and a landscape so devastated it would take generations to recover. When the Red Army finally entered Rzhev in March 1943, they found a ghost town. Out of a pre-war population of 40,000, only a few hundred traumatized civilians remained. The historical philosophical takeaway of Rzhev is a somber reflection on the nature of attrition and the cost of strategic obsession. Rzhev proved that even the most brilliant tactical defense cannot win a war if the broader strategic situation is collapsing. It also demonstrated the terrifying capacity of modern states to absorb losses that would have ended empires in previous centuries. The salient was a monument to the stubbornness of leaders who valued symbols over lives, and a testament to the resilience of the common soldier who fought and died in the mud for a few yards of ruined earth. The silence that eventually settled over the forests of Rzhev was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion. Hundreds of thousands of men remain in the soil there, many in unmarked mass graves that are still being discovered today. The meat grinder was a place where the grand maps of generals met the brutal reality of the bayonet and the shell fragment. It remains a haunting reminder that in the ledger of total war, victory and defeat are often written in the same dark ink of human suffering. The shadows of Rzhev still stretch across the Russian landscape, a silent chorus of the lost who were sacrificed on the altar of a forgotten front. The world remembers the triumphs of the Volga and the flags over the Reichstag, but the marshes of the center hold a different truth. They speak of the grinding, unglamorous horror that defines the true face of conflict. In the end, Rzhev was not won or lost so much as it was endured, leaving behind a legacy of ironies and tragedies that continue to echo through the halls of history. As the sun sets over the reconstructed spires of the city today, the wind through the pines seems to carry the echoes of the millions who passed through this gate of fire. Their names may be faded on the cenotaphs, and their bones may be part of the earth, but the lesson of their sacrifice remains. War is not a game of grand maneuvers, but a heavy, crushing weight that falls hardest on those least able to bear it. The Rzhev Meat Grinder was the ultimate expression of that weight, a dark masterpiece of systemic failure and individual courage that the world must never truly forget.